song of a young man called Jacob Zulu. Zulu. Who suffered for the sins of South Africa. South Africa. This is a song of those for whom the good news, the good news, the good news, the good news of the end of apartheid. If it is the end. Amen. Comes too late. Hallelujah.
Thank you to our actors and our singers for being a part of this day. Incredible. Go out and see this play. This play is going to blow your mind. This is only some of the singers. The full chorus couldn't be with us today, but it is going to be incredible. It starts next weekend, and I hope that you will check it out. One of the things about World Stage Theater Company is that they have conversations at the end of the play because they take on themes that prick our conscience and make us want to think and talk and speak with each other. So check it out. I'm definitely going to be seeing that play. Now, the Song of Jacob Zulu is based on a true story, as I mentioned, of a black youth in South Africa accused of a senseless act of terrorism that claimed both black and white lives. Now, as I mentioned, he was the son of a minister, and he started nonviolently, but was radicalized after watching the brutality of black people all around him in apartheid South Africa. Now, he eventually plants a bomb in a mall, in a shopping mall, which, as reviewers wrote, it's a sad tale of how racial discrimination warps the lives of everyone it touches. Racial discrimination warps the lives of everyone it touches. This is a condemnation of white supremacy and racism more than it is a condemnation of any person in the story, because it warps everyone who's infected by it and affected by it. Now, it turns this gentle minister's son into a mass murderer. The question I want us to grapple with today was suggested by Justin, who leads our AV team. When our worship team saw this scene, he said, and I should say Justin's a son of a minister as well, so maybe he related to this more than most, but he said, I want to know, what does it take to push someone so far into hopelessness that they will betray all of their values? That's the question for us today. Now, a year ago, we watched hundreds of our fellow citizens engaging in a protest that led to the beating and the brutalization of police at the United States Capitol. The FBI has deemed it an act of domestic terrorism. Over 400 of these people have been arrested, and they are not just people living on the far margins of the dark web of the internet. Among them were doctors and lawyers and military veterans and contractors and business people and politicians and some of our neighbors, some of our relatives perhaps. Now, not all of them engaged in violence, but we saw the beating of police officers, some to death, with flagpoles and a fire extinguisher. 2 bombs were planted in Washington, D.C. in public places on that day. Now, I'm not trying to draw any kind of moral equivalency between the people in South Africa who were struggling for freedom and equality with the protesters and the insurrectionists in Washington, D.C., other than to pose the question for our conversation about what does it take for any person to choose violence as a means of creating political change. Now, this is not an academic exercise. Today in the United States, I read that 21 million Americans believe that violence is an appropriate way to create change in American society. 21 million of our fellow citizens. A significant number of Americans believe that we are headed towards another civil war in this nation. Now, it's easy to look around us right now and feel fear and even hopelessness and even hatred. In some ways, it's hard not to feel some of those things right now. Our lives are surrounded by disease and inequality and environmental crises and political polarization. So first, this morning, it's counterintuitive as it might sound, I want to make a case for hopelessness and for fear and even for hatred. Religious people do not give enough acknowledgement to the positive benefits of these emotions that cause people to choose them. It's a common shortcoming of religious people to jump too quickly to hope and love. And there are potential problems in that. The gates over Auschwitz concentration camp during World War II, where they gassed thousands of Jews, had the words above it in German, "Work will set you free," providing hope to keep the people compliant. You may recall when Miguel de la Torre stood in this pulpit some years ago, the professor of social ethics from Iliff School of Theology. He spoke on this topic here. He says, "I find it problematic to hope that all things will work out for the best. History and personal experience shows that it seldom does. Good Christians with plenty of hope in God's protection die in horrible accidents, experience financial collapse, and lose all that is dear to them, just like non-Christians. Bad things do happen, and happen often to good people." He goes on. Modernity has taught us that we as a species are moving towards utopia. Hope exists that the future, thanks to God or science or human ingenuity, will be more forward-thinking and more egalitarian than the past. But what if that's not true? All too often, hope becomes an excuse not to deal with the reality of injustice. What role, then, is played by religious hope? Is it the opiate that Marx claimed it to be? Still quoting from De La Torre, "The reality of reading our daily newspapers is that for far too many who are on the margins of society, there is no hope. Hope becomes an obstacle when it serves as a mechanism that maintains rather than challenges the prevailing social structures." So let's not just jump too fast to hope, just in case it keeps us as part of the problem and not as part of the solution. And let's take a moment to do what's taboo in all churches. Let's discuss the benefits of hopelessness and even hatred. For one, Feeling hopeless protects us from being disappointed. If you don't expect anything good to happen, then you don't have to worry about being disappointed. Being hopeless also might help you feel okay about not taking action. I remember asking a friend, "Why didn't you vote in the recent election?" She had no problem with her decision, saying, "My vote doesn't matter." Hopelessness can make us feel okay about the way we're living. Or my neighbor who won't march in a protest for Black lives, saying, "It's a waste of time. Things will never change." In his seminal book, Jesus and the Disinherited, Howard Thurman talks about the ways in which hatred among the oppressed and the dispossessed can be life-affirming in the face of cruelty and denigration. He talks about how those who are discriminated against, if they accept the judgment of those who look down upon them, then their acquiescence becomes an endorsement of the judgment. He writes, "Because they are despised, they despise themselves. And yet if they reject the judgment, hatred may serve as a device for rebuilding step by perilous step the foundations for individual significance. So that from within the intensity and the necessity, they declare their right to exist despite the judgment of the environment." He talks about how under these conditions, hatred can be a rallying point for the personality. It can be a tremendous source of dynamic energy so that every expression of intolerance and every attitude of meanness and every law that limits and degrades a person becomes not a source of self-negation, but one of self-righteousness. It becomes a tool of survival and dignity. Thurman says, imagine if you were one of 5 children in a family, but the family only has enough money for 4 of everything. And so you always miss out. So that when it was time to buy shoes, they only had enough to buy 4 pairs of shoes, so you didn't get any. And when it was time to buy clothes, there was only enough money to buy new clothes for 4 of the children, and so only you didn't get new clothes. And over again, it happened. The family didn't spread around the misfortune. You always were the one who had to deal with the deprivation of the family. Before long, you would start to hate the whole system and all the people in it. And your hatred would become a kind of affirmation of your own humanity and worth. Now let's return for a moment to the drama that started this conversation, the Song of Jacob Zulu. Jacob watched over and over again the violence and the degradation of his people in apartheid South Africa. And he finally decided that the only thing that he could do was fight violence with violence. Now, if you're a political liberal in America, and I know many of you watching are, imagine a scenario where in the year 2024, after the presidential election, you are told by President Biden and Kamala Harris and other leaders who you trust, Nancy Pelosi perhaps, and by all of the news stations that you listen to and that you trust, that the Republicans have stolen the election through fraud. Is it inconceivable that you or others who you know could decide that it was time to fight to save democracy before we lose it? To decide that fighting under those circumstances is justified. How about in the case of the brutalization of you and your people by another group of people, like in apartheid South Africa or Jim Crow America? Might you say that your movements of resistance be done not out of hatred or hopelessness, but that you're doing it out of love for your people? That the violence is an act of love. You can see the photo of someone holding a sign on January 6th that says, "Guilty of loving America." We can decide that our violence is an act of love under certain circumstances. Sometimes hatred and desperation can give us a warped shadow of a deeper love, out of which possibly those actions have come. Now, if you were convinced that American democracy is being destroyed, as many people are convinced right now, it may be, would you make a decision to go to war to save it? And if you made that decision, would your decision be fueled more by fear than by love of country and love of freedom? Ultimately, Howard Thurman gets to the point where he says, despite all the positive psychological attributes of hatred, hatred destroys, finally, the core of the life of the hater. He tells a story about when he was an undergraduate in Atlanta, Georgia, and a white man came into the president's office where he worked, and the president was busy, so the man engaged Thurman in a conversation. Eventually, he began talking about his two little boys. He said, among other things, I'm rearing my boys so that they will not hate Negroes. The word they used back then. Do not misunderstand me. He said, I do not love them, but I am wise enough to know that if I teach my boys to hate Negroes, then they will end up hating white people as well. Thurman explains, hatred cannot be controlled once it is set in motion. His larger point is that even if our acts of hatred or desperation or hopelessness lead to a sense of self-affirmation of one's own life, even if it also leads to if it also leads to the denying of another person's life, then the taking of the life of others is ultimately a negation of our own humanity. You can't affirm your own humanity and neglect humanity of others at the same time without denigrating your own humanity. In the end, he says, hatred is death to the spirit. And it leads us to a disintegration of our ethical and moral values. And ultimately, Thurman turns to love and nonviolence. He was the teacher of Martin Luther King Jr. He says it's the only action that makes any moral sense. This is why Jesus says, love your neighbor and love God. And he says, love your enemies. We love not only for the impact that it can have on others, but it's also an expression of our deepest humanity. We love not only because of those who we love because it says something about who I am. So hope isn't always good. And hopelessness isn't always bad. And even hatred can have its benefits. But in the end, all of them must lead us to love. Thank you.
It is dark in my mind. It is dark in my heart. In my heart I smell fear, God. It flows over my soul. Really, this man is messenger. Really, this man is a messenger. It is dark, it is dark in my mind. It is dark in my heart. In my heart, I smell tears. In my heart, I smell tears. In my heart, I smell tears. I am wandering and roving all over.
2 shillings.
I arrive in the valleys of Mozambique.
2
They
shillings.
ask, what is your name, boy? I
2
tell them
shillings.
my name is Jacob.
2 shillings.
Away and need, live to fight, fight to live,
Live to fight. Live to fight, fight to live, live to fight. Live to fight, fight to live, live to fight.